So good afternoon to some of you, to most of you, and good morning to some others. Thank you for getting up early. I'm Madeline Postman, and I'm really pleased to present Grain Sustainability's inaugural event, Sustainability Labeling and Consumer Empowerment. The word inaugural and the timing are very deliberate. I think we're all relieved to see Biden in the White House and getting the US back into the Paris Agreement. Now it's time for action. That desire to make an impact is what inspired my husband, Christoph Geppert, and me to reposition Grain's focus from branding, design, and communications to sustainability consulting. Like for many others, the pandemic gave us the opportunity to step back and evaluate what we were doing with all of our working energy, and we decided to make a change. We launched Grain Sustainability towards the end of last year with a mission to help businesses become champions for the planet. On our team is Amber Harrison, who was previously the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility and Sustainability at SITA, a global IT and telecommunications provider to the air transport industry. Also on Team Grain is Mark Carlin, who was most recently Finance Director, Major Projects within Siemens UK. Grain creates the business case for sustainability, and Mark is instrumental in that. Today, we're grateful to Max Yushny from Mondra, who's joining us. Mondra is a data-driven insights platform that supports food system players to meet their carbon neutrality goals, communicate their performance, and drive planet-positive profits. I came across Mondra during an IEMA webinar in November and immediately thought that it's exactly what the food industry needs in terms of labeling. Max will go into more detail, much better than I can, so I'll leave that up to him. I'm just going to share my screen. Let's see, I'm going to try something else so I can make it go full screen. Just 1 second. Okay, cool. So today we'll start with my 10-minute intro, which is a whirlwind tour of labels and certificates. And then Max will speak for about 10 minutes. After that, we'll have about 25 minutes of conversation and then 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. Now for the obligatory housekeeping. Please use the Q&A box only rather than the chat or raising your hand function. And we intend to choose the questions and then let you go onto video to actually ask the question. So if you don't want to go into video, just pose the question anonymously. We also have a few polls for you, so be ready to answer those. That'll be during the conversation part of the event. And we'll be recording the talk and we'll send it out to all ticket holders afterwards. So what are all of these words? You could see it as a day in the life of a sustainability consultant. If you're an ethical consumer, to use the name of one of my favorite publications, these might be the considerations swimming around inside your head whenever you go shopping. As a brand owner attending this talk, you're likely to be aware of every single one of these issues, and you're probably doing something about some of them. And if you're addressing all of them, you deserve a Nobel Prize. You're probably wondering what the best way is to communicate about sustainability. There are currently 456 labels listed on ecolabelindex.com across various industries. Let's look at a few examples. The familiar EU energy label was introduced in 1994. It's recognized by 93% of consumers and 79% consider it when buying energy efficient products. Advances in efficiency since its introduction has meant that A+, A++, and A++ grades have been introduced, skewing the scale towards the top end. Products covered include a range of white goods, in future also bringing in vacuum cleaners, boilers, and water heaters. There's a new classification starting its rollout this year, which goes from A to G only, like the F-rated oven light bulb in this photo. So a bit like what happened with A-levels and GCSEs last year, everything will be shifted around. In this case, an A++ appliance could be re-ranked as a C. The A category will start out empty with few products in the B and C categories, leaving room for new, more energy efficient products to be developed. As this new categorization is rolled out, it will be vital for brands to communicate the change so it doesn't look like all of their products have suddenly been demoted. Now let's move on from white goods to homes. Introduced in 2007, the Energy Performance Certificate looks very similar to the EU energy label. An EPC is needed whenever a home is built, sold, or rented. Recommendations specific to the property are part of the EPC. These are meant to be cost-effective in improving the home's energy efficiency. The EPC is needed at a change of occupancy, so the recommendations are meant to be relevant to any occupier, independent of personal preferences. In aviation, Flybe introduced eco-labeling for aircraft, but unfortunately the company is in administration now. There was another scheme called Fly 360 Green from the World Green Aviation Council, but that also seems to have disappeared since we could find the last press release from 2013. We could spend days, months, or even years on some of these topics, and plastic is definitely one of them. There's an excellent book by Lucy Siegel called Turning the Tide on Plastic, which is a great place to start on your plastic journey. People have to really care and maybe use glasses to look for the number on plastic to see if it's accepted in their council for recycling. And if it wasn't confusing enough already, there are all sorts of other types of plastics: bioplastics made from renewable resources, degradable, biodegradable, home compostable, and industrially compostable plastics. None of these have widely recognized standards or labeling. A few years ago, Grain branded a renewable compostable bioplastic called Florian, complete with its own kite mark, as one step forward in this area. So right now it's up to manufacturers to communicate what type of plastic is being used and whether to recycle it, compost it, or just to put it in the bin. Many of these other types of plastics, like the biodegradable ones and compostable ones, will contaminate otherwise recyclable plastics, which is certainly not the desired result. Priority Direct, which creates planet-friendly packaging, has kindly provided us with this slide on 3 levels of eco-labeling. The first level is to use official markers where available. In absence of that, create straightforward, consumer-friendly communication. And finally, remember that it's an opportunity to speak in your brand's own tone of voice to further educate consumers. Here are a couple more examples of sustainability labeling. A shirt from Allbirds has a carbon footprint of 6.3 kilos of CO2e, that is carbon dioxide equivalent. What does that mean? Is it a lot? Is it a little? Should I buy it? One way of putting it into context is to take the guideline by Mike Berners-Lee in his book, How Bad Are Bananas? And the guideline is to live a 5-ton lifestyle, that is having a carbon footprint of 5,000 kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So how much is that? Just to give one example, a premium economy flight for one person from London to Hong Kong return emits about 4.5 tons of CO2e. So that would be almost your whole allowance for the whole year. So let's look at the green box. This is from a Pukka Herbs tea box. Pukka is owned by Unilever. It's a B Corp, which is one of the symbols on the box. So we know that, that they uphold certain standards regarding governance, community, workers, environment, and customers. And as a member of 1% for the Planet, like Grain and Priority Direct also are members, we know that it donates 1% of its turnover to environmental nonprofits. So here on this Bruce Jack wine box, we have at the left this Integrity and Sustainability Certified label, which has some numbers on it, which give it authority, but at the same time, I don't really know what it means. At the right, you can see that the brand is doing a really good job of communicating about recyclability of the materials and comparing the carbon footprint of a 750 milliliter glass bottle to a 1.5 liter wine box. Unfortunately, I realized that looking at the different sources, everything I could find said that the carbon footprint is more like 1.5 kilos of CO2 or CO2e for the wine bottle rather than 875 kilos, which is a huge difference. I'm just waiting to hear back from Bruce Jack on that. Of course, carbon footprint is not the only sustainability metric, and Max will give us more details about some other metrics that are important. So today, besides sustainability labeling, we also promised you some consumer empowerment. So where to begin? First of all, try to communicate complex information in a simple, immediate way. This challenge will get easier as awareness levels rise. For example, once the general public has a better idea of what 5 kilos of carbon means compared to 50 or 500 kilos. Right now, a typical shopper has a fair idea of the meaning of nutritional values, but not so much for carbon footprints and other sustainability metrics. Secondly, giving context, like the Bruce Jack comparison of a glass bottle to the wine box, once the correct figures are sorted out, certainly empowers consumers. They can actively compare two products sitting on the same shelf. Similarly, providing comparisons like how much energy you use in your home compared to other people in properties of a similar size creates a social comparison and the green nudge. And finally, pushing for industry standards and regulation for sustainability labeling will be the way forward. That might mean participating in consultations through a group like AIMA, or being active within your own industry to push for standards. The goal is to unify metrics, to create better consumer awareness for standardized eco-labels, and to create minimum standards of acceptability in the market, either through regulation itself or through consumer demand. Thank you very much for following along through this whirlwind tour. And now I'm going to hand over to Max from Mondra.
Thank you, Madeline. Thank you. Hello, everyone. As mentioned earlier, my name is Max, and I'm from Mondra. Just going to share my screen. Got a couple of slides to accompany my talk. Great. So over the next 10 minutes, so as Madeline mentioned, I'd like to talk to you about the consumer demand for labeling, status of labels that exist today, especially for the food and beverage sector, problems that we see with the current offerings when it comes to consumer empowerment, and how Mondra is responding to these problems. Now, before I begin, a small caveat. Though Mondra's work focuses on the food and beverage sector, the findings and learnings that I will present over the next few minutes can be easily carried over into other sectors. When it comes to communicating sustainability information with clarity and impact, it doesn't really matter whether it's a sandwich, a dress, or a tire. Without further ado, let's begin. So when talking about sustainability labels and their recent rise in popularity, it is always good to understand the context. For the food sector in particular, there's been a very noticeable rise in consumers demanding businesses to take an environmental stance and share this information transparently. According to one research, as you can see here in the middle, almost 80% of consumers would like to see brands do more to explain their product impacts on the planet. What's more, this feeds directly into the consumer's purchasing behavior, as people are looking to shop with brands that align with their personal values and aspirations. Such noticeable push from consumers could not be ignored by the industry, and we've seen an explosion of various announcements over the past 2 years. Juggernauts like Unilever and Nestle started announcing plans to put carbon labels on all of their products. The British Retail Consortium announced net zero plans in November last year, where over 60 leading retailers, including the likes of Co-op, Lidl, Morrisons, and Ocado, committed to some very aspirational sustainability goals, and carbon labels are part of their roadmap. Oatly, Corn, and Brewdog are some other noticeable examples that launched very planet-focused and transparency-led campaigns in the recent years that you all probably heard of one way or another. So what I really wanted to show here is the sheer breadth of transparency initiatives across businesses of all shapes and sizes in the food and beverage sector, and the fact that carbon footprint labels are really an important part that play a role for all of them. But if we try to categorize the types of labels that exist out there nowadays, especially for the food and beverage sector, we found at Mondra that they broadly fall into 4 categories. First of all, there are the single numeric CO2 values that you can see here on the top left. You might have seen these numbers on the Oatly pack and the Corn packs. Each number, as Madeline mentioned earlier, represents an amount of carbon dioxide equivalent, which was emitted during the production of a single product. Then there are the more kind of visual variations of the same label, which also present the numbers along with the color coding. These are examples from a group of Finnish and French retailers. Then there are also the kite mark labels, which you can see here on the bottom left. Carbon Trust footprint labels are probably the most well-known examples here. The idea is that such a label presents some sort of a standard that was achieved by a brand. And finally, on the bottom right here, there are the carbon offset labels. I'm sure you've seen plenty of products and brands claiming climate neutrality through various labels and badges on their products in your local supermarkets. These are usually achieved when a brand offsets all or a portion of their greenhouse gas emissions using carbon credits. Now, when outlining these broad categories, we at Mondra saw some key problems with them that hindered their effectiveness when it comes to affecting consumer behaviors. First of all, there's the so-called lack of context. Taking the example of corn and Oatly, which you just saw earlier, they are publishing their precise emissions numbers. Now, it is very likely that a consumer will simply have no reference point to judge whether these numbers are good or bad. This lack of anchoring is definitely still a problem, especially when the generic public's awareness of the basic concept of climate change is still pretty low. Another issue is the challenge of comparing seemingly similar claims. When looking at the product on a shelf that claims climate neutrality and another product that claims the very same climate neutrality, both could have achieved the same status in very different ways. For example, one could have gone through a program of carbon cutting initiatives across the business, whilst another just purchased a bunch of carbon credits to offset their impact. In general, this lack of standard method to approach any environmental impact calculation also led to the fact that we still can't, strictly speaking, compare even the numbers that we see on different products. Again, going back to the examples of Oatly and corn, when calculating Oatly's product footprint, they might have accounted for everything up to the point of sale, right? So all the emissions up to the point of sale. Whilst corn, for example, could have cut off their calculation at the point of storing at the warehouse. I will come back to this point in a bit, but it is important to be aware of. Finally, there's the lack of application to the digital medium. As you all know, COVID accelerated digitization by decades, and it is more important than ever to ensure that everything that a business does, including sustainability communication, is created with this digital-first approach. So far, labels are really lagging behind on this front. As such, Mondra saw an opportunity to come in with a new proposition that would ensure the effectiveness of when it comes to the empowering consumer through sustainability information, whilst also driving positive commercial results for our customers. And so Mondra was launched. Broadly speaking, our work, we deliver against three buckets, really. First of all, we help our customers credibly measure their supply chain impacts. Secondly, support them in reducing these impacts through supply chain greening initiatives. And finally, we have a suite of tools that celebrate our clients' environmental performance on pack and online. As you can see here, our customers range from challenger plant-based brands to more established category leaders. And we also work with leading academic, commercial, and non-governmental organizations to continuously update our offering and make it relevant for all food system players, whether they are farmers to all the way to retailers. It is also worth mentioning here on the right that our work is grounded in a Oxford University research, which was published by Joseph Poor and Thomas Nemec a couple years ago. Their paper, which looked at the environmental footprints of over 200 various food products across 40,000 farms, helped us a lot in two ways. First of all, it gave us a standard and repeatable method of measuring the impacts of every food and drink on the planet. This is me referring back to that point of the problem of the lack of comparability when it comes to comparing impacts of different products and how we are fixing that. And secondly, this paper also provided us with a very vivid finding that two products on a supermarket shelf that look, taste, and even cost the same can have wildly different environmental impacts. So by encouraging these marginal changes that do not even cost more, by uncovering this insight into the footprint of a product, we could see a major shift towards more sustainable consumption. And this finding really is what led to the inception of the Mondra's Eco Impact label. Now you can see the label here on the right, mocked up on a pizza box, just to give you an idea what it would look like on pack. You might also point out its resemblance when compared to what Madeline showed you earlier, the EU energy label. And you'd be correct. We derived our label from the successes of the EU energy label, incorporating a letter grade and the rainbow color coding to communicate the environmental performance of a product. Such format has been proven to affect consumer behavior and lead to more sustainable purchases. The idea here is that anyone, irrespective of their understanding of climate change science, could pick up a product from a supermarket shelf and with just a glance understand its overall impact. However, what folds into this label is actually quite sophisticated. Mondra assesses the entire supply chain of a product, starting from the way that its ingredients were grown, all the way to the types of packaging used. We work with the suppliers of our clients to gain as much primary information as we can here, ensuring that our findings are credible and actionable. We then utilize a process known as life cycle assessment, or LCA, to arrive to environmental impacts for each stage of this product supply chain. As you can see here, we don't just focus on carbon impacts, but we also look at biodiversity impacts, the amount of water used across the supply chain, and the amount of water pollution caused. The reason here is that although we recognize carbon being at the top of the agenda of governments and businesses, we simply cannot ignore other vital parts of our planet. And if we ignore them, we might be risking sleepwalking into another environmental disaster a couple of decades down the line. So that's why they are integrated into our label. And all this impact data then gets folded into a single grade, which you see here at the bottom. We don't stop there though, and acknowledge the importance of absolute numbers when it comes to impacts. To that end, we also issue each product with its ecological impact table, which you can see here at the below nutritional information table. Now, when designing this system of on-pack communication, we followed a strict order, starting with a very visual label to quickly communicate the overall performance first. Then, for the more engaged consumers, they can flip the pack and look into the absolute numbers. And finally, for the most engaged shoppers out there, you can see a link here at the bottom, as well as a QR code. Now, these act as bridges to the online experiences that have become so much more important over the past year or so. First of all, each product that we assess gets issued with its own certificate page. This acts as a source of all information when it comes to the environmental performance of this product. The idea is to provide an engaging interface that invites your consumers to explore and raises the public's awareness about climate change and why the brand's actions are important. But we didn't want to stop there, and thought of offering a native integration of Mondra into the e-commerce experiences of our clients as well. Now, this opens up a whole new world of possibilities. With this integration, we're able to not only showcase the labels of each product, but also present information in different contexts, like comparing performance of our clients' carrots to the average performance of carrots across the UK supermarkets. So again, just creating that additional context for the consumers to make it that much more actionable and relevant. The beauty of the digital environment is that it also allows for constant tracking of results. So we're able to very quickly see how the new integration affects sales of the more sustainable options. Now I'm going to start wrapping up here. Just be mindful of the time, but just to summarize the key takeaways here for you. First of all, it is clear that the demand for sustainability labeling exists. And if anything, we're likely to see it grow over the next few years. Secondly, the food industry is starting to respond to these trends, and more brands are embarking on these transparency journeys across the sector. Now, as you begin to consider the best way to communicate information for your brand, whether you're in the food industry or not, and whether you're planning on employing a third party or developing an in-house initiative, do make sure to learn from the incumbents. You know, whether it's the EPCs that Madeline showed earlier, or the EU energy labels, or Mondra's example, there is enough data that exists out there that could help you inform your decisions on this front. And finally, I might be getting a little bit philosophical here, but really the journey to the label is just as valuable as the label. As you begin your work towards obtaining any sort of certification, you will learn a tremendous amount of information about your impact as a business, about the impact of your supply chains. You will also get data that can lay the foundation for your improvement strategies, that can feed into your commercial decision, and offer an additional opportunity to win your customers' loyalty. I hope that this was interesting. Thank you for your attention. You're more than welcome to put me any questions following the event. I'm usually pretty responsive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Max. That was really interesting and informative. So I think we'll start off. So we've got about 20 minutes now for a conversation amongst the five of us, leaving 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. So I'm going to start this off with a poll. So here's our first poll. So would you choose one product over another because it has an eco label? So I'll just give everyone a little bit of time to talk about that. And then I suppose, Amber, maybe if you want to start off with a question, that would be great.
Absolutely, and thanks, Max. I find it really interesting seeing these different kinds of labels and in that kind of red, amber, green format. I was interested that there's a demand from consumers to see more labeling, and that some of the big companies are starting to take action. But are you seeing any increasing demand from big retailers and supermarkets to drive that down through their own products and their supply chains?
Yeah, that question. It's actually been there for a while. You might remember Tesco was pioneering the way, I think it was in 2007, 2009, when they made a very ambitious pledge to carbon label 70,000 of their SKUs. Now, regretfully, they had to drop that initiative because the process just worked out to be way too cumbersome. It was costly, it was slow, so it was dropped, I think, in 2012. Nowadays, with the availability of tech and data, it's being picked up, and the British Retailers Consortium pledge is just one of the really big examples. I think it's around 66 or 67 retailers spanning various sectors that are participating and really working towards a net zero agenda, part of which is to make sure that their consumers are aware of the environmental impacts of the products they're buying. So we're likely to see more and more of this happening, and this, as the agenda becomes kind of gets rolled out, it's going to be more formalized in the communication of these retailers. So yeah, I'd imagine over the coming months and years, it's only going to grow.
It's encouraging to know.
So poll results are in. So about half and half would buy one product over another with an eco label, and half maybe. So.
Oh yeah, I think that makes sense.
Of course, we have a particular audience here as well.
A very woke audience for sure.
Yeah. I'll just launch the next one, which is, have you ever purchased a product based primarily on its sustainability labeling? And I'll leave that up while, let's see.
Yeah, I think just the whole idea of sustainability labeling is very broad, right? When we talk about it, it's not just the carbon footprint labels. People might think of organic labels as well. People might think of vegan, fair trade. They all feed into this narrative of sustainability. So it's interesting to see these results here.
So we've got about the same number who voted last time. So I'll share that now. So we've got, those are the results here.
Okay.
Great.
Interesting. I suppose there are so many other factors. Like the next poll, this is our last poll, just doing 3 in quick succession. Other factors like paying more. So of course, sustainability labeling isn't the only consideration. Of course, there's brand, quality, price, if it's a white good, whether it actually fits into the space it's meant to fit into. So would you pay more for a product with an eco label for two things that might be similar? So does eco labeling merit a price premium? And I think while we're waiting for those results to come in, it could be interesting, Mark, for you to go ahead and quiz Max.
Yeah, the last poll was kind of leading into it, and the next poll and the results, when that comes out, will be extremely interesting. I'm just interested, Max, whether there's any data yet that suggests that people are buying more when they see a product that's labelled in an eco understandable way, and also whether they're prepared to pay a bit more for it. So ahead of the results of the next poll, here we go. I'm just interested to know what you think from the general side, and here we've got some specific data.
Yeah. Oh, actually, the data that we've found and that we've gathered through our own research mimics the poll's findings quite closely. There's been a research published by NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business Research around 1.5 years ago, I think, where they went to assess consumer purchasing trends for sustainability marketed products. Now, it's not strictly speaking sustainability labeling, but it's products that feature more sustainability heavily in their marketing. And they found that from 2013 to 2018, these products grew 5.5 times faster than conventionally marketed products. and that for 90% of individual product categories, so these categories could be like soups, cookies, energy drinks, and whatnot, the growth of sustainability marketed products outpace the growth of their respective categories. So that finding in general just proves the massive demand for the sustainability marketed options. And our own research, which we conducted last year, we surveyed a group of around 500 representative consumers and found that about 70% of them were willing to pay 6% or slightly more. I think it was about 6% for food products with a Mondra label on them. So again, this warrants for some ideas that there's obviously a desire to, first of all, purchase these options, and then maybe even invites a certain price premium. But yeah, I think hopefully over the next few years we'll be gathering more and more data here, especially as Mondra continues to work with retailers and our brand partners.
It's interesting to see, though, Max, that even in a group of people who is quite selected as today, there are still a large majority of people. Sorry, not a large majority. There's a substantial amount of people who are hesitant. So it's not a clear decision. It depends on other factors as well.
Yeah, I'd imagine that just the how much more, right? Are we talking about 5% more? Are we talking about 15% more? And I think it's also just what good. It depends on the 5% for a car is very different than 5% for a bag of crisps. So
we do like a bag of crisps. But I'm interested as well, actually. I mean, that 6% is a really interesting figure. And as you've been going through this kind of whole labeling process and carbon footprint, has it thrown up any other kind of particular surprises or insights for some of the clients you've worked on? Is there anything that's kind of been a bit of a wow moment?
Yeah, actually every engagement so far has had at least one wow moment. One client of ours, just to tell you an anecdote, through our finding, we found that one of the ingredients was responsible for a substantial part of the impact that their product causes. And through our research, we were able to identify a farm set of farms closer to home that would that employed better practices, better irrigation practices, better farming practices. And by making that switch, almost within several months they did that, they were able to reduce their greenhouse gas impacts by 20% and their water usage by 21%. So, and what's really interesting is that that change didn't even involve any cost premium. So really these changes that we're trying to identify within the supply chains of our customers. Another one that might be a bit controversial for this talk, but fully vegan foods are not universally better in terms of impacts. Sometimes the ingredients that are used are simply not the best grown ingredients. What we've also seen is that the supply chains are very volatile, have very volatile demands. So what happens occasionally is that a product might be sourcing ingredient from Asia, and then it gets shipped to Australia to get processed, and then it gets shipped back again to Australia, to Asia for processing. So all this kind of, just the lack of very concrete supply chains lead to unproportionate impacts. So yeah, it's been really interesting just working with each customer on that front and helping them understand this.
But where do you start then? I mean, as a company, you just mentioned the complexity of supply chains, and I think anybody who works in sustainability knows about how quickly it becomes a difficult path to travel to find all your carbon footprint in your entire supply chain. So where do I start as a company?
It's really just about measuring. Start with measuring first, whether it's with Mondra, or whether with someone else. If you're looking, for example, for a product level insight, it is so worth doing life cycle assessment. You will be surprised by what it will uncover about the impact hotspots within your business. And that data will inform improvement strategy. You might not even want to label. You might not even want to start communicating this straight away, but it will provide you that hard data then to go away and start forming those improvement strategies. So it's always worth starting with measurement first. And because that data might dictate actions which will have very noticeable results rather than something that, for example, you might have seen your competitor do, but for you, it might not have the same impact. So measure first, then manage. I know it's very cliche, but it works here just as well.
And it's interesting because one of the big supermarket chains, when the subject became hot again, I guess, to be more obviously sustainable, they started labeling all their packaging, which they reduced quite swiftly in the volume of packaging they're using for the same product. And they labeled everything and just said 37% less packaging than before. And I guess it's one of those easy claims. It's an easy win because you can make that claim isolated. You don't have to go into the entire supply chain, but it communicates a benefit both for the company, for the consumer, and for the environment.
100%. No, there are low-hanging fruits by all means, but if we are talking here about the climate emergency, right, and I think all the people in the audience here are aware of that. It is the point of that we don't have much time nowadays, and making sure that every action is not only manageable for the business but also delivers the most positive impact is something that I think businesses that are going to go into the future and really win customer loyalty should be considering that. And there's a very appealing story to tell around that, right? That we 37% packaging reduction is interesting, but we actually looked into our supply chains and managed to slash our greenhouse gas emissions by 40%. That's good in anyone's books. That's COP26 worthy, you know. So I think these stories are the ones that we're trying to surface here.
Of course.
So, and you mentioned the life cycle piece, and I've done a bit of life cycle analysis in my time. It's fairly full on. So where do you define that scope? So, for example, where do you start and finish the measurements, you know, from the creation, the distribution, the selling, the final use? How does it work?
Yeah, so Mondra, as I mentioned in my presentation, we are grounded in the Poor and Nemeczek research that surfaced from the University of Oxford. And in their research, they assessed everything from cradle to supermarket shelf. So kind of from the moment that the ingredients are grown all the way to the point of sale. We do our LCAs in a similar way, just to make sure that there is a fixed method that we can replicate across every single food and drink. However, at the moment, and again, you might have remember that from my slide about the label, when it comes to the labeling, we do it from the primary up to the primary processes ready for sale stage, or up to the storage space, you know, until it goes to the retailer. Now, the reason why we dropped the retail stage is that a huge number of products have a single packaging. That means the same product in the same packaging is sold online. It's sold in retailer stores, and it's sold across various geographies. There is a certain amount of variation that causes to the impact of the product, and we obviously couldn't put a separate label on each package. So at the moment we dropped it, but we're looking for ways to start communicating this in a much more adaptable fashion. And this actually invites an interesting question as well about what about in use, right? What about the impact of a product after the purchase? What about household wastage and disposal, which are huge problems as we know of? And we are exploring this under our alignment with Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Unfortunately, the data at this stage today is very variable, right? Even within a country, what people do with their waste varies. When we go to the individual level, the differences are huge. Taking an example of London, right? Even within boroughs, some boroughs compost, some boroughs offer a way to recycle glass and paper separately. So there's a lot of variability here. Something that we're acutely aware of and working towards with our partners to fill the gaps with. So hopefully, again, in the coming years, we'll be able to start looking at the entire life cycle. But at the moment, we draw a strict boundary which allows for this the replicated effort across every single food and drink.
Keeps it consistent.
Exactly.
I think the question of complexity is a huge thing, and maybe if I just briefly share my screen, one of the examples which I found and I thought was very interesting was the question of car tire labeling. So recently bought one because the potholes came to me, and the conversation was bordering around price, which is unsurprisingly. And then almost by accident, the conversation went on performance, and performance was then measured in fuel efficiency, which is one of the three categories in the tire labeling, eco-labeling, which exists. but it took a little bit of a further conversation about performance in wet conditions, and the noise conversation was almost non-existent. So those were the three categories. But what wasn't part of the conversation with the sales agent at the time was the all-important economic benefit, which is implicit here, because if I use less fuel, that's great, not just for the environment, but also for myself. But beyond that, there's also implicit in this information set, there is the fact that a more expensive tire with less wearing rubber compound means I can drive the tire for longer. So while the most expensive tire was probably 2.5 times the price of the cheapest one, it was lasting 3 times as long, according to the data. So, but do you give everybody always the data that is available, or do you narrow it down? And I think Mondra has found a beautiful balance in that, to kind of give key information in items which are on people's mind. But we have to probably find different ways in different product categories to communicate the important information for make good decision, and sometimes to leave things out so that people don't stop reading or listening.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid comment. Interestingly, it's just this, going back to what Madeline mentioned and what I mentioned as well, this idea of setting context is absolutely essential, whether it's converting it to something that people care about, obviously the money they can save potentially, whether it's in the example that Madeline showed, showing that by purchasing this carton pack of wine, you'll be saving this much more compared to the glass bottle of wine. But it's constantly drawing to things that people can anchor to and just understand, I think, is essential. Yeah, no, I hope. And interestingly though, with a nutritional label though, right, they do not state specifically that by eating more products that contain higher amounts of saturates or sugars, it would cause, it would lead to potential health problems, right? But there was a massive campaign by governments, by various agencies that informed a whole generation of people about that. So, is it a question of a campaign that comes alongside with such labeling, or is it something that we communicate on the label? Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it invites a very open discussion. But yeah, this context is absolutely essential.
Mark, I'd love to have your thoughts on from the financial side of things on this topic.
Well, I think it's been interesting to hear several times during this conversation that there's clearly a business case for taking a more sustainable option, and it might not be obvious. And you know, drawing on the example that Christoph brought in, trying to find a way of making sure that the message really gets the point across. You know, it isn't just, does it cost more to do something in a more sustainable way? There's probably a really good business benefit for doing it. And you know, Max's point about the journey towards the label and discovering what you might euphemistically call product tourism as it kind of floats around before it gets to its eventual destination. There's implicit cost in all of that. So having a really hard look at your business, taking a more sustainable option, there's probably going to be some real measurable economic benefit for doing so. And it's just a matter of how we most efficiently bring that to the surface that's intriguing me at the moment anyway.
Fantastic. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We've got 15 minutes left. I've chosen a few questions. Jack Thompson, I'm going to make you into a panelist so you can go on video. If that's not okay with you, just gesticulate when you get on screen, and I'll take you back out again, and I'll read out your question. So, yeah, are you okay to say your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering how the different components were weighed. How can you know, if something's a D in biodiversity, how does that weigh up being an A in your your carbon?
Yeah, no, very valid question, Jack. I think maybe just to it invites this whole question about benchmarking, and to get a grade, you need to benchmark towards something, right? And when we were designing our whole grading methodology in Monja, we came to it from a commercial angle, obviously, which meant that as well as giving consumers a fair idea of the impact of the food that they're buying, we also needed to give businesses an opportunity to improve. EU energy label, for example, does not face the same problem. They just slap a rating on the device and that's that. So to give businesses an opportunity, we adopted the following approach. First of all, we measured the impacts through all 4 life cycle stages, right? So you might remember farming, transport, processing, and packaging. We then rate performance of each raw ingredient, so at the farming stage, against the database which was compiled by the Oxford University researchers. They use nutritional categorization to compare food products to the ones with similar nutritional composition. So basically comparing proteins versus proteins, veggies versus veggies, etc. We then rate the performance of the other product stages, so transport, processing, and packaging impacts, against Mondra's basket of goods. This is a UK standard shopping basket of goods, which consists of 20 items in total. The original basket was actually defined by WWF and Tesco as a way of mapping environmental impacts of the most purchased foods. We use a derivation of that. So basically, farming is being compared to the database. All the other impacts are compared to the basket of goods. All these performances are then combined to a single grade. And to your question specifically, we actually weigh carbon more than the other 3 criteria. So carbon is 50% of the label, and the other ones are the 50% is broken down evenly. The reason for that is carbon is on everyone's agenda, right? It's the most pressing matter that everyone's speaking of, and we wanted to acknowledge that. So how the exact grade works out to be, taking your example with biodiversity scores D, carbon scores A, really depends on a whole bunch of factors. Yeah, just I hope that this gives you an idea. The carbon is weighted a bit more, and what the system also managed us to do is basically make sure that if we're scoring a beef product, it's not going to universally score bad. There's an opportunity for beef products to improve if they use better farming practices, and if, for example, we're comparing beef which was reared on the UK farmlands versus beef which was reared on the deforested land in Argentina. So it's these comparisons that we're trying to make here. Does it answer your question?
Yeah. I guess it's what you say about making complex ideas simplified for consumers to understand. But I guess on your last point, it'd be interesting to see, where does, let's talk about beef, so beef that has been raised in a feedlot but has lower emissions because it's less methanogenic than something that lives a lot longer and grass raised probably doesn't do quite so well on the emissions, but it's complicated.
Yeah, exactly. There are numerous factors to consider here, but we just wanted to make sure that everyone has a fair chance at improving, and that consumers are aware that even if you're the biggest carnivore that exists, you can still be making these marginal improvements by simply looking to buy products which came from more sustainable backgrounds.
And I think some of the other questions which came in from Nicola and Dimitra, the question is simplicity versus a sufficient amount of information. So is a carbon calculator a good thing? Yes, of course it is. It gives you some sense of information. Does it give you the entire picture? Probably not. Sufficient? Maybe, but unlikely. And I think there's a lot of need to educate, but also to simplify. And I think you can educate consumers, or you can simplify information for consumers not having to be educated. And that balance, I think, is what we need to strike right. And it will go across lots of industries. Hopefully, everybody will at some point have to be accountable, whether it's through a label or an accreditation process or something else. But the first stages need to be to provide information at that point of complexity that people buy into it and want to be part of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a great, let's see, sorry, I'm just trying to, I'm demoting you, Jack. I'm making you an attendee again. I feel like I'm
Thanks, Jack.
Or something. Thank you. So I'm going to promote Barbara de Brouwer. Again, I hope that you're ready to talk, to ask your question.
Yes, hi. I just had a question around consumer awareness. Like, imagine that you're pioneering in your industry and you're going through the journey to put carbon labels, or not labels, but the environmental labels on your packaging. But imagine that your labels would be quite red. For example, if you're in a high meat intensity industry, is there any research that has been done that it would put consumers off, and that they would maybe switch to something that does not have a label because they see like a big red label and think, oh no, this is not good, I'm not going to take that one. And just to your point, you say like the journey is equally important as the label, which I completely agree. Knowing where you are at and knowing what you can improve is definitely the first step. But then would it make sense to put on a bad label or not so good label on your packaging, if that might influence the customer behavior?
Yeah, no, Barbara, very valid concerns, and something that we get a lot during the calls with prospective customers. Two-part answer. First of all, referring back to our consumer research, we actually posed the question, which sounded something like, if you were facing two similar products and one of them had a C grade label and the other one had no label whatsoever, which one would you purchase? And interestingly, 65%, I believe, something similar, said that they would still purchase the product with a C label. Now, what is like post C label is obviously a different story, but even this kind of, we always consider C being kind of this break-even point. So even at that point, consumers are still willing to go with some awareness of the impacts versus none whatsoever. Now, second part of my answer is, of course, there is obviously some reputational risks that might come from the fact that a product might be scoring low. But we actually have a couple customers now that managed to turn this whole narrative into, rather than look at us, we are pioneering, look at us, we are pioneering, we're not doing well, we're acutely aware of that. Here are the steps that we're going to be taking over the next 3 years to improve. So, you know, they're starting to take their customers on this whole journey of showing some sort of vulnerability, understanding that there are shortcomings to their processes, yet laying out a very clear strategy to what they're going to do, and sharing the kind of the findings and the actions with the consumers. I think there's something very, very empowering in that, and we've seen a couple brands now do it. One of them is a vegan brand, which as I said, they were thinking that they wasn't going to score A+, but they didn't score as well as they could. They're now launching this whole campaign about that. So that's also part of the question. And then if a brand completely refuses and says like, we do not want to do this, risks outweigh the benefits, for Mondra at least, we never force anyone to go ahead with the label. So these findings are with you, and you could decide we're going to keep it under the veils for the moment, spend the next year or two improving, and then start sharing it. So it really depends, you know. Some brands, for some brands, it speaks to their brand voice and they want to be open and transparent. For others, they want to improve first and then do a grand opening. Several options here, but yeah, they all lead to this, hopefully to the same outcome.
Makes sense. Thanks for explaining.
Good. No worries. Thank you for your question.
Thanks for your question, Barbara. So I'm going to sort of put together a few different questions. They're about sort of pace of change, regulation, why should people trust labels that aren't regulated, if it's self-regulating, and any drivers for brands to adopt these labels if they're not regulated. So that's not really a question, but maybe if you can address, I mean, one,
a little narrative here.
Yeah, what role does the government play in this? And yeah, I suppose just the threads that I just mentioned in general.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So in terms of the regulation, Mondra is aware that in the EU, as well as in the UK, there are conversations happening. Some of them are facilitated by the British Retail Consortium, others facilitated by a group of retailers headed by WWF. But there are conversations, there are open inquiries that the government is starting to look into the carbon labeling space. So though we know that the government moves slow, the fact that these conversations are beginning both in the EU and in the UK are very promising. What that means, though, is that sooner or later, there's going to be some sort of a regulated way to share your impacts. Mondra's been working to be part of these conversations. As you saw, we're working with WWF quite closely and a group of other retailers to make sure that the solution is in line with what we've been offering. So we're quite optimistic about this sooner or later becoming a legislation. Now about consumer take-up, this is a more difficult question, especially when it comes to labels that are being offered by non-governmental entities. Mondra's actually on that front, we're evolving, right? And as I kind of hinted on, label is not only what Mondra does. So we are actually, as part of our evolution, we're quite happy to make sure that label is not our property. And we're talking to a couple of NGOs at the moment to basically get them to represent our label and provide this authority that it does not come from a commercial entity. We recognize that for consumers, for businesses, this means this brings more weight, and then if this means that we will be creating more impact, more positive impact over the years, so be it. I think this is the movement that we're hopefully going to be moving towards over the next few months and years. And as that happens, or as that rollout happens, there's going to be more campaigning. And as you saw me point out on the slides, the fact that such juggernauts like Unilever and Nestle and the British Retail Consortium are all starting to think of this will mean, whether we like it or not, that labels are sooner or later going to start appearing on packs. So people are going to become more and more aware of this impact. So the future looks bright. I can't tell you exactly how many years it's going to take, but the world is changing. The world is waking up to this crisis that we're facing, and food is going to play a very critical part in this.
And I think a super important part is whatever this is, however it's going to work, it's transparency which will drive the process. Whether that transparency comes because of how Mondra presents its facts and creates the data, whether it's accredited assessors. The whole food industry is already full of accredited assessors of one kind or another for a purpose of food quality. There are processes in place, so we can create quality of data, we can create transparency in many ways, and whether that involves governments or not is to be seen. But the more global it is, the better the footprint will be. You see the initiatives of the World Economic Forum to develop together with the big four accountancy firms, to create a standard for sustainability footprints. There's a lot going on, and whether it will be truly global or partially international or on national levels but comparable, we will need to see. A lot of this is growing while we're talking about it. So nobody has been there. So everybody needs to come up with their good ideas and throw them into the pot.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to throw out as our last question what might be a curveball. We'll see. Ed, if you're ready to go on screen.
Yeah, hi there, Madeline. Thanks for having me. Max, thanks for the time today. It's been really fascinating. And congratulations on all the work that you're doing. It looks fantastic.
Thank you.
Potentially a little bit of a curveball. Have you looked at or spoken to anybody in the hospitality industry in addition to retail? And if so, how do you see this model translating to restaurants, pubs and bars and being adopted by the kind of on-trade sector?
Yeah, thank you for your compliments first, Ed. Yeah, we've spoken to several chains of restaurants actually right now. There's a lot of interest. The offering is slightly different, and you're correct. We're talking about a supply chains that vary, menus that change seasonally. Mondra's solutions actually allow for that. So the whole Mondra ecosystem is underpinned by the so-called Mondra platform. And what it is basically an interface that compiles all this impact data that we assess and allows for constant product iteration and product building. So it actually feeds very nicely into the model of operations of pubs and restaurants and bars. This idea that it might even pull in from the restaurant's recipe management systems, and something that automatically will throw up results for various impacts of the food products. So there is demand, and we've been in conversations. They're actually very likely that this year we'll be working with a chain of restaurants that you probably heard of. So it's been quite exciting in that front, and Mondra's solution actually underpins it quite well.
Fantastic, really useful, thank you.
No, pleasure.
And Amber, you mentioned protocols for the events industry to assess impact, which are in existence already.
Yeah, certainly. We were having a conversation a little earlier today and talking about the fact you can have carbon neutral events. You know, there is a process for certifying those. So it's quite interesting to see things which might feel a little bit intangible actually having a credible metric. And that was one of the comments that came up on the chat actually from Zainab, was how do you have the sustainability credentials, the credibility that come through? So I think the use of frameworks or standardization or structure gives consistency and confidence to consumers and retailers alike.
Fantastic. So I see we're just a couple of minutes over, and sometimes people have back-to-back calls and things like that. So I think we'll wrap it up. I wanted to thank you again, Max, very much for joining us, and all of everyone who joined us today for the talk. We really appreciate it, and onward and upward.
Thank you all. Really enjoyed this.
Cheers.
Bye.
So,
take care, everyone.
To leave us some feedback, what you think, and whether you have any ideas or any questions. We'd be curious to hear from every one of you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.